Jesus said, "How long shall I be with you and speak with you? I am weary of this generation. They proved me 10 times, but these 20 times, and 10 times 10." Okay, so what can we make of this? Well, first of all, the question is basically being asked, how long shall I be with you and speak with you? So the people that he's with are the ones he's addressing. And the question he's asking is, how long will I be with you and speak with you? So who does he speak to? The ones he's speaking to figuratively, if you want to see it in a spiritual sense. In the physical, yeah, he's talking about the people who were there bodily and physically. But in the metaphysical, he's talking about the Christians in the Christian age. And then he makes this contrast. I am weary of this generation. What generations? The one that prove him. This generation, they proved me 10 times. So, first of all, which generation? The one he was with there physically, um, the the Jews, the people who were opposing him at the time. These were the ones that represent those of the age, because again, the 10 times. Okay, so we understand that there's 7,000 years or 7 days or 7,000 years that we are going to live on this earth. 6,000 of those are given over to man. But 3 of these years of the 7,000 years run concurrent with the 7,000 years. That is, Jesus comes in at around the after the 4,000 years, let's say, so right around the fifth day. So his counts for the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh day, because again, he reigns for 1,000 years, or that seventh day. So when you add his 3 to the 7 that are given over to man, that makes 10 times. So that's the age. But these 20 times and 10 times 10. So a couple things. 20 is double 10. So we see that there's a factor of 2 involved here. And also the 10 times the 10, again, the 10 times, but these 10 times over, right? So in other words, 10 is used in both of these numbers. This is 20 is 2 times 10, or 10 plus 10, in other words. And 10 times 10 is 100. And what's interesting about this is, of course, if you multiply 20 times 10 times 10, you end up with 2,000 years. And that pretty much answers the how long shall I be with you and speak with you. Jesus says, I came to put an end to sacrifice, and unless you cease from sacrificing, anger will not cease from you. Now, this harkens back to what we understand from the book of Hebrews. Like, for example, here in chapter 8. I mean, the theme runs throughout Hebrews, but it's basically the contrast between the earthly high priest, such as is represented by Aaron. Remember, there was Moses, and there was Aaron, the tables of Moses, the rod of Aaron, if you will, and the golden jar of manna, the hidden manna, which is the hidden testament. But the contrast was between what is heavenly and what is earthly. Now, sacrifices are an earthly thing. Sacrifices are where you take an earthly animal or some kind of earthly product, and you burn it, you consume it, you dedicate it, you do something to it ritually, as a service to God and man. And basically, this seems good on the surface because you're doing something that you think is helping, but it is according to your idea of what is good. And so it's on the level of the flesh. Hebrews makes this contrast because Jesus is a different kind of high priest. His is not an earthly high priesthood. His is what they call the order of Melchizedek. So apparently, earthly ministers do it at an earthly altar, whereas the priest that is after the order of Melchizedek, that is to say, Jesus himself, we have such an high priest, who is literally at the right hand of the throne in the majesty in the heavens, who is a minister of the sanctuary and of the true tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. So again, God and man, the difference here. the idea between the heavenly and the earthly. So all this, it goes on about the sacrifices and everything, and you can read it all in its details. Basically, all along those lines, a high priest on the earth is but a shadow. It's just, it goes on. For every high priest is ordained to offer gifts and sacrifices, wherefore it is of necessity that this man have somewhat also to offer, because he sins, right? So he's got to offer even for himself. He's not clean. He doesn't sit at the right hand of the throne of the majesty of heavens. He has to offer even for himself. And it says, for if he were on earth, he should not be a priest, seeing that there are priests that offer gifts according to the law, which again, who serve as the example and shadow of heavenly things. So in just the same way that man at an earthly altar is not standing at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heavens, right? Neither is the shadow like the heavenly. Okay, neither is the earthly like the heavenly. All right, it's so far, it's as far apart as the earth is from heaven. And he's saying that the heavenly priest is completely outside of this realm. All right. So as long as we continue to sacrifice, as long as we continue to do those things, right, his anger will not cease from us, because we are doing things after an earthly image and after the shadow and not the things of themselves. It goes on. Jesus said, "Ye know not of what spirit you are. For the Son of Man came not to destroy men, but to save them." Now, again, this is along the same lines, but obviously this is from Panarion, and this is from an actual manuscript of Luke. There are variations, of course, in manuscripts. You can look into the differences between, say, the Alexandrian manuscripts or the Textus Receptus. Now, I always prefer anything that has the Textus Receptus, because that contains hundreds of other words and many dozens of other verses from the Alexandrian manuscripts. And there are a number of possibilities, which I won't get into, but this is an example of one of those kinds of additions, where some manuscripts have this statement and some don't. So the actual context of this is known. You can go back into Luke 9:51 through 56, and we'll just read it from beginning to end. And it says, "And it came to pass that when the time was come that he should be received up, he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." Again, when he's going to the physical Jerusalem or whatever, there's also a spiritual dimension to it. Because what he does in the physical, he does sort of as a parable, as a shadow, if you will. Jesus is himself the Logos. So when, for example, Jesus is put on trial, that's an image, if you will, a shadow, if you will, of the Logos also being put on trial. That is to say that it's railroaded, that people spit on it and abuse it and stuff, and it serves as an analog. It gets torn up and shredded with holes and everything. And a lot of these manuscripts, for example, that we run into are that way too. They're abused, they're shredded, they're full of holes. They were spat upon by historians and lost and forgotten and so on and so forth. But the idea is that he's going on to a heavenly Jerusalem, that the Logos, if you will, or Jesus, is moving on up to a heavenly Jerusalem. And so he sent messengers before his face. And again, this is an image of him sending the apostles through the age. And they went and entered into the village of the Samaritans. Which again, if the road is time, and the movement across the age, as roads tend to be, it's what you travel to get from here to there. And here is one point in time, and there you get there is another point in time. So a road is basically time. And they entered into the village of the Samaritans. Now, one of the interesting things about the Samaritans, you can look this up, are known for having a very limited canon. They were Jews, but they only accepted the actual Pentateuch itself, the 5 books of Moses, as being inspired, and everything else they consider to be apocryphal. In much the same way, as he's going through the Christian age, they are also going to have a very limited view of the scriptures. They're also going to have sort of a limited canon. So the village of the Samaritans is kind of referring to the Christian age to come. Now they went to make ready for, they were going to make ready for him, that is to say the apostles and the people who went before him. But they did not receive him because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem. So in other words, they didn't accept him in the sense that the logos is this broader context, this greater truth, that um, that his face as though he would go to Jerusalem basically means he's saying one thing. His face, what he is expressing, what he is placing before the world, the plain meaning, if you will, of the scriptures, like what you're seeing right now, that heavenly level meaning or whatever, is set towards the heavenly Jerusalem. And so because their focus is essentially on the idea, it's a very small sort of canon, a very small box they put God in. They can't look towards the heavenly Jerusalem the way Jesus did. They can't accept him and his heavenly meaning, because again, he's speaking of things beyond the present age. He's speaking of the heavenly Jerusalem to come, in a metaphorical sense. And when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did? But he turned and rebuked them and said, You know not of what manner of spirit ye are, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. And they went on to another village. So that's the verse you see here. But seeing it in its context, there's a lot more information here. Now, first of all, I always look for who's with Jesus. Sometimes you see it's usually James, Peter, and John. Those are the most interesting ones when you see those three, because remember on the Mount of Transfiguration, and we talked about this, how there appeared Jesus, and there was Moses, and there was Elijah. And we talked about how Peter, while he was on his way through to Caesarea Philippi, was asked by Jesus, whom do men say that I am? And of course the answers were, some say Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets or something come back to life. And then Peter specifically was asked, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says to Jesus, well, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. So he defines Christ as meaning in his mind, the Son of the living God. So the living God and Christ, that's the living meaning. And him being the Son, of course, he is the second, if you will, of three testaments, the Son, if you will, of the Father. Anyway, so Peter and Jesus correspond to each other at the Mount of Transfiguration, because Jesus turns around and says, "Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, son of John." Because flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father, which is in heaven. So flesh and blood is being contrasted with heaven. And so, in other words, he says, and I say that thou art Peter, and upon this rock, because Peter means rock, I will build my church. So the church is associated with Peter basically at that point. And we see Moses and Elijah. Of course, Moses came before, chronologically anyway, came before Jesus. Of course, Jesus came before everything, of course. But in the chronology, there was Moses, and then thousands of years later come Jesus. So the idea is that Moses represents the Old Testament here. Jesus represents the New Testament. And Elijah, who, again, he prophesies, he says, Elijah will come and set all things right. That is to say, Elijah comes as a future revelation to set everything right that was wrong. And so that leaves John, which, of course, James and John. Who are James and John, I guess, is the question. So in that particular picture, again, you have Moses, you have Jesus, and then you have Elijah. And Jesus corresponds with Peter because, again, he says, thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. So one of these has to be the Jews, and one of these has to be the elect. Now, we know that John follows Peter chronologically and appears at the end of the age. Because in the Gospel of John, the way it ends up is that Jesus is walking with Peter, or Cephas, as it says, And he asks him, do you love me more than these others? And, he says, yes, I love you more than these, right? And he says, well, feed my lambs, right? And then he asks him another time, and he says, tend my sheep. And he asks him another time, and he says, feed my sheep, which that's an interesting discussion. But then he's walking along with Peter, and he says, well, what about, and he tells him about the death that he has to undergo. And then Peter kind of is a little bit angry, and he's like, he points at John, or he indicates John, and he says, well, what about him? Um, what is he going to go through? And Jesus says, well, if he should remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me. So in other words, Peter needs to follow Jesus first, because the church in a way, is the village of the Samaritans. They're going to die, if you will, a spiritual death. That is to say, they're going to have a limited canon, and they're not going to see this revelation, and therefore it is up to John, I guess, as the symbolic apostle, who will be there at the time of his coming, in other words, to bring in that third revelation. So that leaves James to correspond with Moses, which is, of course, the Jews and what. So when his disciples James and John saw this, they said, Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did, right? Then you can see that sort of Elijah connection there, that John is in a sense connected with Elijah. And he turned and rebuked them and said, you know not of what manner of spirits you are, for the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Now, the idea that the fire come down from heaven to destroy them and consume them, right? But he has a different idea. He has come rather to save them. So in other words, how is he going to save them, right? And then they went on to another village, which is, of course, means that they pass through the Christian age, and they come to a different place where presumably they would accept him. Now, it goes on. Jesus said, they who are with me have not understood me. And this is echoed. This is taken from the Acts of Peter. And this is echoed here in a couple of Psalms here, which develops the idea. The strangers with whom I have mingled have not known me. That is to say, again, the Christian age is marked by this spirit, if you will, of sacrificing, if you will, to animals and to man and not to God. I mean, an earthly sacrifice and not a heavenly sacrifice. In other words, they don't let the logos, if you will, be the sacrifice. They want to interpret things on a fleshly level. They want to have a limited canon, etc. So they haven't known him because he is the logos. They tasted of my sweetness and have desired to keep me with them. That is to say, they want to put God in a box. They want to see him on the fleshly level, if you will, and contain him. It says, though I became life for them. In other words, they tasted of his sweetness. They understood the mystery. They became death for me. In other words, they subverted it. They turned it from the heavenly to the physical. They stopped seeing me as the heavenly high priest and started looking towards the earthly. Which, again, I'm not going to get into religion, but there were offices, let's say, that were created, if you will, so that men could take the glory and men could have control and men could say what was right and what was wrong. These books are in, those books are out. This means this, that means that. And they set up their own kingdom against God. Again, how long is he going to be with them? As long as they continue to do this, right? That is to say, set up their kingdom against him. So it says, though I became life for them, he manifested himself to them. He showed them the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. They became death for me. They subverted that. I bore them up, and they have worn me as a garment. That is to say, they took the fleshly religious robe, if you will, of the term Christian. They took his name. I am all in all. The heavens are borne by me. I am the foundation which supporteth the worlds. I am the light that shineth forth and maketh souls to rejoice. I am the life of the world. So in other words, if you hear him speaking through these words in this arrangement, revealing the truth, about how he is everything, he is all in all. That means that you could just go up to anything at random. You could go to a tree and say, well, he's all in all. He's all in that, right? And so what's all in that, right? Isn't there DNA in that? Aren't there molecules in that? Aren't there little tiny animals that burrow their way into the flesh and they live off of the tree? And aren't there fruits and stuff that come as a result? I mean, he's all of that. He's saying he's all of that, that the heavens are born by him. So if there are such things as planets and stars and galaxies, then the forces that live inside of these uh, bodies or whatever are him. He's that powerful. That he's the foundation which supporteth the worlds. And again, if there are other worlds, other planets or whatever, or if he's talking about inner worlds, worlds on top of worlds on top of worlds, you could see it like that. I mean, the microcosmos, the cosmos at which we live, the broader cosmos or whatever. It's just order within order, within order within order within order, right? And God is basically saying he is all that and their foundation. So he's talking about it in sort of a metaphysical sense, but also that extends all into the very literal sense. He says, I am the light that shineth forth and maketh the souls to rejoice, which is going, that light is going to make us come alive. In other words, that once the light comes on in our heads and we wake up to the fact that he's speaking to us right here, right now, through the power of the Logos, if you're seeing this and you're understanding it, then of course your souls are going to rejoice. Like it says in the gospel of truth, the gospel of truth is joy to those, who come across it. So in other words, he's going to bring the world to life through the recognition that the strangers who gave us this falsehood are going to be understood. They're going to be exposed. He's going to tell us basically straight up that they don't know what they're talking about. They have not known me. They tasted of my sweetness and desired to contain it. In other words, I became life for them and they became death for me. That is just so true. Because this is not what they have taught. They have worn the garment of religion, but they have not taught God as being truly all in all and the foundation of the worlds. They have not truly given us the light that makes our souls to rejoice. They've basically just kept him dead for 2,000 years. The vain garment of the flesh I have stripped off. Again, we have to go from earthly sacrifices and earthly priesthoods and earthly understandings of things. Again, I like how this previous one, it shows the dark side of what happened to him, and it also shows the light and the promise that he holds in a sense because this happened to him. But they clothed him in a fleshly garment. In other words, they wore him as a garment. In other words, they subjected him, they wore me as a garment, right? In other words, they used him as a cloak for a pretense of righteousness, let's say. But he's so far beyond their words, their assertions, their power. He's so far beyond them. So in other words, it's a vain garment. It's a fleshly garment, and he's taken it off. So in other words, by revealing what he really is, the life of the world, all in all or whatever, he stripped off that fleshly garment, that illusion of him being just the flesh. And so he says, rejoice and be glad, and add joy above your joy, for the times are fulfilled, that I may put on my garment, which is prepared for me from the beginning. Rejoice and be glad, for you are blessed above all men on earth, because it is you who shall save the whole world. Again, because he is the life of the world, because he is the light of the world and makes souls to rejoice. If the souls are rejoicing, right, then we understand him, and we are able to save men. we are able to, instead of calling down judgment and suffering upon men, we are able to pull down light from heaven, if you will. And instead of consuming them and destroying them, we can bring them to life.